The air in the grand conclave of the Cathar Dominion was a solid thing, ancient and heavy, tasting of ionized ozone and the cold, metallic scent of absolute authority. It was an atmosphere crafted over millennia of conquest, a pressure meant to crush dissent before it could form into a coherent thought. At the heart of this oppressive stillness, High Executor Zorval stood before the obsidian throne, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the chilling void of the star charts that swirled in a slow, majestic vortex above. The chamber was a testament to Cathar philosophy, vast, brutalist, and forged from the core of a shattered moon. Light did not dare enter. It was generated from within, cold and sterile, bleeding from crystalline veins embedded in the polished black stone. Legions of delegates, the lords and marshals of 100 conquered worlds, stood like statues in their designated alcoves, their carapaces gleaming, their silence a weapon in itself. Today, that weapon was aimed not at each other, but at the ghost that had entered their perfectly ordered galaxy. The ghost had a name: Earth, a primitive, solitary world huddled around a G-type star in an uninteresting spiral arm, a place the Dominion had only recently deigned to notice. Their discovery had been met with the standard Cathar protocol for nascent species approaching the threshold of interstellar travel, a protocol of dominance, of absolute and unquestionable containment. The message, projected now in the swirling holographic heart of the chamber, was a masterpiece of intimidation, refined over cycles of subjugation. It was not a request. It was a law delivered from a superior power to an inferior. It spoke of boundaries, of forbidden technologies, of the consequences of unsanctioned expansion. It was a cage of words, and it had been sent to this fledgling race called humans. And then, for a period of time that stretched from unnerving to insulting, there had been nothing. A profound silence that seemed to mock the Dominion's power. Grand Marshal Vorlag, his armored form a monolith of obsidian and crimson, broke the suffocating quiet. His voice was the grinding of tectonic plates, a sound that had heralded the breaking of empires. The silence was a test of our resolve. They delayed to gauge our impatience, a classic tactic of a cornered primitive. They believe we will grow complacent. They mistake our patience for weakness. He gestured a massive, clawed hand towards the star chart, where the solitary point of light representing the human system pulsed with an almost insolent calm. We sent them the mandate of containment. It is the clearest, most unambiguous declaration in the lexicon of galactic law. It offers two paths, obedience or extinction. There is no third. Zorval did not turn. His gaze remained fixed on the swirling data stream, a river of cold, hard facts that offered no comfort. He had reviewed the initial scouting reports 1,000 times. The humans were a cacophony of contradictions. They transmitted a chaotic storm of electromagnetic radiation into their skies. Art, music, endless arguments, signals of profound mathematical elegance buried in an avalanche of trivial noise. Their world was a patchwork of warring tribes that somehow maintained a fragile global civilization. They were technologically adolescent, barely able to manipulate the gravity of their own planet. Yet their theoretical physics, gleaned from intercepted academic transmissions, bordered on the dangerously profound. They were a paradox, and paradox was a concept the Cathar, a species built on unyielding logic and singular purpose, fundamentally distrusted. Chaos was the enemy. Chaos was the primordial sludge from which all threats emerged. Silence was not empty, Grand Marshal, Zorval said, his own voice a low resonance, a contrast to Vorlag's percussive force. Our deep-range sensors, the ones you deemed a waste of resources to aim at a pre-interstellar culture, detected anomalies. He signaled with a subtle flex of a manipulator tendril. The holographic display shifted. The image of the human message faded, replaced by complex energy readings, graphs of quantum entanglement flux, and charts of subspace resonance. For the duration of their silence, the entire magnetosphere of their planet began to resonate at a low, almost undetectable frequency. The energy expenditure was considerable, far beyond what our models predicted for a civilization at their stage of development. They were not merely silent, they were preparing something. A ripple of unease, a subtle clattering of carapaces passed through the assembled delegates. Vorlag scoffed, a harsh, grating sound. A planetary defense shield, a desperate, futile gesture. They are armoring their cage, High Executor. It changes nothing. The mandate was not a negotiation, it was a statement of fact. Their compliance is inevitable. Let them exhaust their meager resources on these pathetic displays. It will only make the final subjugation swifter. And what if it was not a shield? Zorval countered, finally turning his ancient eyes toward the Grand Marshal. They were deep, complex organs, capable of perceiving a spectrum of light and reality that made Vorlag's singular, aggressive vision seem painfully narrow. What if it was an antenna? What if their entire world was being turned into a broadcast array? The question hung in the cold, still air, pregnant with implications that disturbed the rigid certainty of the conclave. The Cathar communicated through directed, focused energy streams, precise and efficient. The concept of using a planet itself as a communication device was grotesquely inefficient, a brute force method of unimaginable scale. It was the sort of thinking that belonged to a force of nature, not a sentient species. It was chaotic. It was then, as the debate teetered on the edge of a new, deeper anxiety, that the alert chimed. It was not the sharp, piercing cry of a military threat, but a soft, almost melodic tone reserved for the arrival of priority diplomatic communications. Every eye in the chamber snapped to the central hololith. The data stream from the human system, which had been a quiet river of passive sensor readings, suddenly surged. A single, focused transmission was piercing the void, aimed directly at the Cathar capital. It was not a broad-spectrum cry for help, nor the chaotic noise of their usual broadcasts. It was precise, deliberate, and it was impossibly powerful. "They are responding," Vorlag boomed, a note of triumphant finality in his voice. "At last, the primitives have found their courage and chosen their path. Display the message. Let the conclave bear witness to their formal surrender." The technicians in the lower pits, their forms small and servile beneath the towering delegates, complied. The incoming signal was routed to the main display. The chamber waited, a predator coiled to strike, ready to receive the expected pleas for mercy, the groveling acceptance of terms, the final, pathetic whimper of a lesser race acknowledging its master. But there were no words, no images, no data packets. There was only a sound. It filled the vast chamber, not from the holographic emitters, but from the very structure of the room itself. It was a single, pure, resonant tone that seemed to bypass the auditory senses and implant itself directly into the consciousness. It was not loud, yet it vibrated in the obsidian floor, hummed in the crystalline light veins, and settled deep within the chest cavity of every Cathar present. It was a note of impossible clarity, a sound of such mathematical perfection that it felt more real than the stone and metal around them. It was a frequency that spoke of immense, patient power. It was the sound of a star being born and the sound of a mountain eroding to dust, all at once. For a long, suspended moment, the lords of the Cathar dominion, the conquerors of 1,000 suns, were utterly, completely silent. They did not understand. The message contained no information. It was an auditory event devoid of language or intent. It was a violation of every known protocol of communication. Then the central display, which had been trying to translate the signal into a recognizable format, finally resolved the transmission into the only symbol it could. A single, stark, alien glyph flickered into existence, floating in the center of the chamber, rendered in cold, white light. It was a simple word from the human lexicon, the one their linguistics machines had identified as a conjunction, a term of opposition, a pivot point in logic and grammar. The word was but. It hung there, a silent counterpoint to the all-encompassing sound. A pure, perfect tone and a single, defiant word. Grand Marshal Vorlag stared, his certainty cracking like stressed armor. His military mind, trained to see threats in every shadow, could only process this act in one way. It was not surrender. It was not a plea. It was a response to their mandate of containment, to their declaration of absolute power. The humans had received a statement that allowed for no argument, no conditions, no negotiation. And they had replied with the foundational word of argument, of condition, of negotiation. They had replied with a word that negated everything that came before it. This is their answer," a delegate from the outer rim whispered, his voice thin with disbelief. Zorval's mind, however, moved past the initial shock into a place of cold, terrifying clarity. The sound, the word, the planetary-scale energy expenditure, it was all connected. This was not a message of defiance in a way Vorlag could understand. It was not a challenge to a fight. It was something far more profound. It was a correction, a refutation of the Cathar's fundamental premise. The Cathar had said, "You are contained." The humans had replied, "But." The Cathar had said, "We are the law." The humans had replied, "But." The sound was the power behind that word, a demonstration of capability so vast and so alien in its application that it defied military classification. Vorlag, his mind snapping back to the familiar comfort of aggression, slammed a fist onto the railing of his platform. The sound echoed like a thunderclap, but it was swallowed by the persistent, resonant hum from the human signal. This is an insult, an act of unparalleled arrogance. They dare to answer the Dominion's mandate with a semantic trick. It is a declaration of war. They have sealed their fate. He turned to the obsidian throne, where the silent emperor watched, his presence a gravity well of pure authority. My emperor, the path is clear. The primitives have chosen extinction. I request command of the annihilator fleets. We will cleanse this stain of chaos from the galaxy and remind the lesser races of the price of defiance. The chamber erupted in a chorus of assent, the war marshals and sector lords roaring their approval. The promise of battle, of a clear and simple solution, was a siren song to the Cathar psyche. But Zorval stepped forward, his form casting a long shadow in the cold light. The resonant hum continued, a constant, unnerving reminder of the unknown. "No," he said, his voice cutting through the clamor. The sound was not loud, but it carried an authority born of wisdom, not rank. The chamber fell silent once more, all eyes on him. He addressed the emperor, but his words were for all of them. "You are mistaken, Grand Marshal. That was not a declaration of war." He gestured to the floating word, to the sound that still vibrated in their very bones. That was a declaration of existence. They have not threatened us. They have not challenged our fleets. They have simply informed us that our authority, our law, our entire framework for understanding the universe ends at the edge of their system. They have drawn a line not in space, but in philosophy. To cross it with warships would be a profound mistake. We are not dealing with primitives. We are dealing with something else entirely. The emperor, who had not moved or spoken, shifted his immense form upon the throne. A low, guttural inquiry echoed through the minds of every delegate, a telepathic command that chilled the soul. "Explain. Why do you hesitate, High Executor?" Zorval looked at the word, but floating in the void. He felt the hum in his ancient bones, and for the first time in his long life, standing at the heart of the most powerful empire in the galaxy, he felt a dread that was deeper and colder than any fear of war. It was the fear of the incomprehensible. "Because," Zorval said, his voice barely a whisper, "I believe that single word backed by that sound is the calmest, most absolute, and most terrifying threat I have ever witnessed." The silence that followed was different. The first had been one of anticipation. This was a silence of dawning, horrifying doubt. The Cathar Dominion had sent a threat to a quiet little world, expecting a scream or a bow. Instead, Earth had replied with a conjunction, and it felt like the universe had just been torn in two. The persistent, perfect tone finally ceased, plunging the chamber into an abrupt and unnerving quiet. The floating word, "but," dissolved into motes of light, leaving only the swirling star chart and the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the conclave. Yet the echo of the sound remained, a phantom vibration in the memory, a ghost in the machine of the Cathar Empire. It left a void, a question that the combined intellect and military might of the Dominion could not answer. The human response had not been an act of war, but it had accomplished what no fleet could. It had sown profound uncertainty in the heart of an empire built on absolute certainty. For days, the conclave was paralyzed. The Hawks, led by Grand Marshal Vorlag, raged against the perceived insult, their calls for immediate and overwhelming retaliation growing more strident with every passing cycle. They framed the human response as a mockery, a juvenile semantic game played by a species too cowardly to fight and too arrogant to submit. Their logic was simple, brutal, and deeply appealing to the Cathar warrior caste. A challenge, no matter how esoteric, must be met with force. An anomaly must be purged. Chaos must be stamped into order. They drew up battle plans, simulations of planetary bombardment and atmospheric incineration, presenting them to the Emperor with graphic, visceral detail. They spoke of righteous fire and the restoration of galactic hierarchy. Zorval, however, spent those same days in the deep archives, in the silent data vaults that held the unfiltered sensor logs from the Sol system. He ignored the political clamor, the saber-rattling of the marshals, and immersed himself in the raw, cold data. He was not a warrior. He was a statesman, a scholar of power in all its forms. He understood that the most dangerous weapon was not the one you could see, but the one you could not comprehend. He replayed the resonant frequency, running it through every analytical filter the Dominion possessed. It was not a weaponized frequency. It did not degrade matter or disrupt energy shields. It was, according to the archivists and physicists he consulted, something far stranger. It was a perfect harmonic of the background radiation of the universe, amplified and focused into a single, coherent note. It was the sound of spacetime itself, given a voice. And the energy signature, it was not a weapon discharge. It was a controlled, sustained release from the planet's own magnetic field. The humans had not built a superweapon. They had, in a manner the Cathar's most brilliant minds could not fathom, played their own world like an instrument. The scale of such an act was geologic, not technological. It was this fact, more than any other, that chilled Zorval to his core. The Cathar built great ships to travel the stars. The humans, it seemed, were learning to tune the stars themselves. He brought his findings before the Emperor in a private audience, away from the roaring of the warhawks. In the silent, cavernous throne room with only the two of them present, the immense weight of the Emperor's silent scrutiny fell upon him. "They did not use a weapon, my Emperor," Zorval stated, his voice steady despite the gravity of his words. "They used a proof. The transmission was a demonstration of a principle. They have a mastery over fundamental forces that we, for all our star-spanning power, have never even considered. To attack them with our fleets would be like a child throwing stones at a master artisan who is quietly carving a mountain." The Emperor's telepathic presence filled his mind, cold and analytical. The artisan could still be crushed by a falling rock. Their mastery of resonance does not preclude their vulnerability to plasma fire. Perhaps, Zorval conceded, but the message was not just the sound, it was the word. But it implies a condition, an alternative. They did not say no. They did not say never. They challenged the premise of our mandate, not the fact of our power. I believe they are inviting a different kind of engagement, a dialogue. To answer an invitation for dialogue with an armada is not a show of strength. It is a show of fear, the fear that we might lose the argument. This was a dangerous, almost heretical thought within the Cathar Dominion. The Dominion did not argue, it decreed. It did not debate, it commanded. To suggest that their philosophical foundation could be questioned was to shake the pillars of the empire. The Emperor was silent for a long time, the weight of his contemplation a palpable force. Zorval waited, his fate and the fate of a species he had never met hanging in the balance. Finally, the silent command came. "You believe we should speak to them?" "I believe we have no other logical choice," Zorval replied. "We must understand the nature of the power they demonstrated. We must understand the philosophy of a people who would answer a threat not with a threat but with a proposition. To act in ignorance is the greatest strategic failure. Let me go to them. Let me be your envoy. Let me face this argument." The decision, when it was announced, sent a shockwave through the conclave. Grand Marshal Vorlag was incandescent with rage, viewing it as an act of supreme weakness, a betrayal of Cathar dominance. But the Emperor's will was absolute. The Annihilator fleets were ordered to stand down to hold their positions at the edge of Cathar space. A single diplomatic vessel, the Unwavering Gaze, was to be prepared. Zorval himself would lead the delegation. The humans had already transmitted coordinates for a meeting point. A desolate, lifeless moon orbiting a gas giant in a neutral, unclaimed system equidistant from both their worlds. A location of perfect, mathematical neutrality. Another subtle, unnerving sign of their precision. The journey to the designated coordinates was a silent, tense affair. The crew of the Unwavering Gaze were hand-picked for their discipline, but even they could not fully conceal their apprehension. They were traveling to meet a species that had communicated with a sound that defied physics and a word that defied an empire. Zorval spent the voyage studying the scant information they had on humanity. He watched their recovered broadcasts, a bewildering kaleidoscope of violence and compassion, of breathtaking art and base cruelty. He saw images of their wars, brutal and savage, yet also saw them building intricate cathedrals, composing soul-wrenching music, and sacrificing themselves for abstract ideals like love and freedom. They were a species of profound, horrifying contradictions. They were chaos incarnate, yet their message had been one of perfect, resonant order. As the Unwavering Gaze, a vessel of imposing Cathar design, all sharp angles and dark, menacing armor plating, dropped out of hyperspace at the designated coordinates, the sensor readings were anticlimactic. The void was empty, save for the silent, pockmarked moon and the swirling, banded face of the gas giant. There was no fleet, no defensive perimeter, nothing. For a full rotation, they waited in orbit, scanning, probing, on high alert for any sign of an ambush. Vorlag's paranoia had been infectious, but the void remained placid. Just as Zorval began to suspect a trick, a new kind of silence, a new test, a single, minuscule energy signature appeared on the long-range sensors. A lone vessel, impossibly small by Cathar standards, was approaching on a slow, deliberate trajectory. It was so small, in fact, that the Unwavering Gaze's automated threat assessment systems initially classified it as debris. The ship, as it grew closer, was a marvel of minimalist design. It was a smooth, ovoid shape of a pearlescent white material that seemed to shift in color with the angle of the light from the distant star. It had no visible weapon ports, no shield emitters, no engine arrays. It moved with a silent, graceful efficiency, propelled by a drive system that left no detectable energy trail, a feat of stealth technology that was, in itself, a statement of profound advancement. It was the physical embodiment of the calm, precise message they had received. It was not a warship. It looked more like a scholar's vessel or a diplomat's shuttle. It came to a halt a respectful distance from the Cathar ship, its presence a quiet and unassuming question mark in the vastness of space. A communication channel opened, using a universal mathematical language, a language of prime numbers and quantum constants that spoke of a deep understanding of the universe's underlying structure. The message was simple, direct, and contained none of the honorifics or titles the Cathar expected. This is the human vessel soliloquy. We are ready to receive your envoy. We propose a meeting aboard our vessel where the environment can be perfectly calibrated for your species, comfort, and safety. The offer was, on its surface, a gesture of peace, but to the Cathar it was another subtle power play. They, the dominant power, were being invited into the unknown territory of the lesser race. It was a breach of protocol, but Zorval, remembering the resonant note, understood. The humans did not operate by Cathar protocols. They operated by their own. To refuse would be to show fear, to cede the philosophical high ground before the dialogue even began. "We accept," he transmitted back, overriding his security chief's frantic protests. "I will come alone." The journey across the void in a small Cathar shuttle felt like crossing a vast philosophical chasm. As he approached the human ship, its serene, featureless hull filled his view. An almost invisible seam dilated, opening an airlock with a silent, fluid motion. Docking was an automated, seamless process. When the inner door opened, he was not greeted by armed guards or a sterile decontamination chamber. He was greeted by a space that was calm. The interior of the human ship was as unexpected as its exterior. It was not the cold, functional chrome and steel he had anticipated. The walls were a soft, matte gray, and the lighting was warm and indirect, simulating the gentle glow of a sun. The air was clean, perfectly synthesized to match the atmosphere of his homeworld, a gesture of consideration that was both disarming and deeply unsettling. There was a sense of life here, of organic comfort that was utterly alien to the Cathar aesthetic of brutalist function. A low, soft sound, a melody of complex, shifting harmonies, played from an unseen source, and he recognized the patterns of their strange art form called music. It was designed, he realized, to soothe. A single human figure stood waiting for him in the center of the reception chamber. It was smaller than him, fragile-looking in its simple, unadorned gray uniform. The being was female by Cathar approximation. Her face was pale and symmetrical, and her eyes, a startling shade of blue, regarded him with a calm, analytical curiosity. There was no fear in them. There was no arrogance. There was only a profound, unnerving stillness. "High Executor Zorval," she said, her voice a calm, even tone. The Cathar language came from her mouth flawlessly without the aid of a visible translator. "I am Ambassador Eva Rostova. Welcome aboard the soliloquy. Thank you for coming." Zorval stopped before her, his own imposing height and armored form seeming out of place, brutish in this serene environment. He had prepared 1,000 speeches, 1,000 diplomatic gambits and veiled threats. All of them now seemed crude, clumsy, like bringing a battering ram to a debate. "Ambassador," he began, his voice a low rumble. "Your species was sent a clear and binding directive by the Cathar Dominion. Your response was unconventional." She nodded slowly, her expression unchanging. "The mandate of containment. Yes, we studied it with great interest. It is a fascinating document, a window into the Cathar psyche. It is built upon a series of axioms you hold to be self-evident. That strength confers the right to rule. That order is superior to chaos. That the unknown must be controlled. That yours is the ultimate authority in this galactic sector." "These are not axioms, Ambassador," Zorval corrected, his voice hardening. "They are truths proven over millennia of galactic history. They are the principles upon which civilization is built and chaos is held at bay." "They are the principles upon which your civilization is built," she replied, her tone gentle but firm, like a teacher correcting a student. "Our response was intended to communicate a simple concept, that your truths are not universal, that your axioms, while valid within your own frame of reference, do not apply to us." She gestured to a viewing port, which until now had been an opaque gray wall. It shimmered and became transparent, revealing the vast, star-dusted emptiness of space, and in the distance, the looming, dark shape of the unwavering gaze. "You sent us a statement of absolute power," she continued, her blue eyes still locked on his. "We could have responded with our own statement of power. We could have shown you our fleets. We could have engaged in the familiar calculus of threat and counter-threat. It is a language we understand very well. Our own history is steeped in it." A flicker of something ancient and sad passed through her eyes, a shadow of a memory of a pain he could not comprehend. "But to do so would have been to accept the premise of your argument. It would have meant we were playing the same game. We are not interested in that game." "So instead you sent a sound," Zorval said, the memory of that perfect, unnerving tone vibrating within him. "And a single word." "Precisely," she said. "The sound was a demonstration, not of a weapon but of a capacity to interact with the universe on a fundamental level. We did not project that sound at you. We simply altered the resonance of our own star system and allowed the truth of that resonance to propagate naturally across space-time. It was the universe itself that delivered the message. We were merely the composers." She paused, letting the immense implication of that statement settle in the silent room. "The word 'but' was the thesis. It was the most efficient way to communicate our position. Your mandate is a complete declarative statement, an enclosed logical loop. To argue against it point by point would be to validate its structure. The only way to truly respond was to add a conjunction to open the statement up, to indicate that the sentence was not finished. You said, 'You will be contained.' We replied, 'But perhaps we will not.' You said, 'We are your superiors.' We replied, 'But that is a matter of perspective.' We did not reject your declaration. We amended it. We introduced a new variable into your equation, us." Zorval felt the foundations of his Cathar certainty beginning to crumble. This was not a negotiation over territory or resources. This was a confrontation of philosophies, a clash of realities. The humans were not barbarians. They were thinkers, scientists, artists of a terrifyingly advanced order. Their logic was as elegant and as unyielding as their resonant note. "You speak of perspective," Zorval countered, mustering the weight of his own tradition. "There is only one perspective that matters in the face of overwhelming force, the perspective of the victor. The Dominion's fleets are vast. Our soldiers are bred for war. Your mastery of resonance may be profound, but can it stop a plasma bolt?" For the first time, a faint, sad smile touched Ambassador Rostova's lips. "That is the question, isn't it, High Executor? The one your Grand Marshal is so eager to answer. Let me answer it for you. No. A plasma bolt is a localized event of brute force. It cannot be stopped by a harmonic frequency. But the ship firing that bolt is a complex system of matter and energy held together by fundamental forces. The mind of the being who gives the order to fire is an electrochemical process, a symphony of neural signals. We do not need to stop the bolt. We would only need to retune the symphony." The air in the room grew cold. The implication was monstrous. She was not threatening to destroy their ships. She was threatening to unmake them, to dissolve them back into their constituent parts, to silence the minds of their crews without firing a single shot. It was a weapon so subtle, so absolute, that the Cathar had no name for it. It was not war. It was erasure. "You see," Rostova said, her voice now soft with a strange kind of pity, "this is why we did not want to play the game. When you have the ability to end a conversation so completely, the only ethical choice is to do everything in your power to ensure it never comes to that. We did not send you a threat, High Executor. We sent you a warning about the profound, catastrophic consequences of forcing us to speak your language of violence. We sent you a plea. To choose a different conversation." Zorval stared at her, this small, soft-skinned creature who spoke of ethics and philosophy while calmly describing the ability to unmake reality. He saw now the truth behind their chaotic broadcasts, their warring tribes, their violent history. They were a species forged in the crucible of their own contradictions. They had wrestled with their own chaotic nature for millennia and had emerged with a control, a discipline of thought and power that made the Cathar's rigid monolithic order look like the work of children. They were not chaotic, they had mastered chaos. "What conversation?" Zorval asked, his voice now devoid of its former authority, replaced by a raw, genuine curiosity. "Do you wish to have?" Ambassador Rostova's faint smile returned, but this time it was warmer, an invitation. "The one that begins after the word, but. The one about what is possible when two different forms of intelligence acknowledge each other's existence without the prerequisite of dominance. The one about the universe and the truths we might discover together. It is a much more interesting conversation, I think. She gestured towards a table that had risen silently from the floor, bearing two simple chairs. It will be a long conversation. Please, sit. Zorval looked from the human ambassador to the viewing port, where his warship hung like a relic of a bygone era, a monument to a philosophy that had just been rendered obsolete. He had come here as an executor of an empire's will, a symbol of its power. He now understood he was a student, and his lesson was just beginning. He slowly, deliberately moved to the table and took a seat. The real meeting had just begun. The dialogue between Zorval and Ambassador Ristova extended for what felt like an eternity, a deep and complex exchange that transcended the simple mechanics of diplomacy. It was a mutual dissection of two civilizations, a laying bare of souls on a species-wide scale. Ristova, with her preternatural calm, guided the conversation. She answered Zorval's pointed questions about human history not with shame or defensiveness, but with a quiet, scholarly acceptance. She explained humanity's long, brutal climb from tribal warfare, the ages of self-inflicted horror, the ideological plagues that had nearly consumed them time and again. She called it their Great Filter, a period of intense internal struggle that every intelligent species, she theorized, must pass through. Those who failed destroyed themselves. Those who succeeded emerged with a profound understanding of their own capacity for both creation and destruction. Your species' high executor, she explained, her voice a soft, analytical hum, achieved unity through conquest. A single dominant philosophy suppressed all others. It created stability, a powerful and efficient empire. But it is a brittle stability. It has never been truly tested by a contrary viewpoint it could not simply crush. You built a wall to keep chaos out. We ingested it. We wrestled with it until it became a part of us. Our unity is not one of singular belief, but of a shared understanding that all beliefs must be allowed to coexist. We are not a monolith. We are a symphony full of dissonance and harmony, and we have learned how to conduct it. Zorval listened, the concepts washing over him, eroding the bedrock of his Cathar identity. He began to see the Dominion not as the pinnacle of order, but as a system arrested in its development, a culture that had chosen power over wisdom. He described the Cathar fear of the unknown, their obsession with control, their belief that the universe was a hostile force to be tamed. Ristova listened patiently, her head tilted in a gesture of deep concentration. We do not see the universe as hostile, she countered gently. We see it as indifferent. It operates on principles of staggering complexity and beauty. To try and tame it is an act of profound arrogance. Our goal is not to control it, but to understand it, to find our place within its intricate, flowing logic. The power we have demonstrated is not a weapon we forged to conquer our environment. It is a consequence of our attempts to listen to it. This, for Zorval, was the great reveal. The Cathar saw technology as a hammer, a tool to bend the universe to their will. Humans saw it as a sensory organ, a way to perceive the universe more deeply. Their resonance technology was not born from a desire for a superweapon, but from a desire to hear the fundamental music of spacetime. The weaponization of that ability was a terrifying but secondary possibility, a possibility they actively sought to avoid. As the meeting drew to a close, a sense of profound, tectonic shifting had taken place within Zorval. He saw the path forward not as one of conflict or submission, but of something far more challenging, coexistence, a partnership. The Cathar had strength, discipline, and a vast, stable infrastructure. The humans had a depth of understanding, a philosophical maturity, and a mastery of fundamental forces that bordered on the sublime. Each had what the other lacked. Our emperor will not easily accept this, Zorval stated, the practicalities of his situation reasserting themselves. The war marshals will see your philosophy as a contagion, your calm as a trick. They will demand proof of your power, a demonstration they can understand. And that, Ristova replied, her expression turning grave, is what we fear most. A demonstration they can understand would be an act of such violence that it would make dialogue impossible forever. It would force us to become the monster they imagine us to be. We sent the resonant note precisely because it was a demonstration they could not easily understand. It was an invitation to ask questions, not a reason to draw weapons. The fact that you are here, High Executor, is a sign that the invitation was not entirely ignored. She stood, signaling the end of their conversation. Return to your conclave. Tell them what you have learned. Tell them that we are not a threat to the Cathar Dominion. We are, however, a challenge to its definition of itself. The choice of how to respond to that challenge is yours. We will await your decision, but we will not wait indefinitely. The universe is not as empty as you believe it to be. That final, cryptic statement hung in the air as Zorval returned to his shuttle. The journey back to the unwavering gaze was a silent one, his mind a maelstrom of new ideas and terrifying possibilities. When he returned to the Cathar capital, he was met with suspicion and hostility. Grand Marshal Vorlag immediately accused him of being indoctrinated, of falling for the cunning psychological tricks of the primitives. The conclave was reconvened, and the atmosphere was even more tense than before. Vorlag and his faction had used Zorval's absence to whip the delegates into a frenzy of militaristic fervor. They painted the humans as deceitful manipulators, their calm a mask for sinister intentions. Zorval stood once more before the obsidian throne, but this time he was not the cautious executor. He was a changed being, an envoy who had glimpsed a different reality. He did not speak of threats or military capabilities. He spoke of philosophy. He spoke of the brittleness of their own ideology, of the strength in humanity's acceptance of paradox. He described their mastery of fundamental forces not as a weapon, but as a state of being, an extension of their desire for understanding. "We sent them a cage," Zorval's voice resonated through the vast, silent chamber, "and they responded by showing us that the bars were made of ideas, not of steel. They have not trapped themselves inside. They have simply pointed out that the cage is an illusion. To attack them is to attack a concept. It is a war we cannot win because our weapons are made of matter and their shield is made of logic." Vorlag erupted. "Logic, they are a chaotic infestation, a disease of thought. You speak of philosophy while the Dominion's authority is mocked. The Emperor's mandate was answered with a but. There can be no greater insult. We must act. We must burn their world and salt the ashes with their own convoluted words." The chamber roared in agreement. The call for war was overwhelming. Zorval saw the future balanced on a knife's edge, a catastrophic, one-sided conflict that the Cathar would initiate and that humanity would be forced to end, an act that would stain both species for eternity. In the face of the mounting fury, Zorval made a final, desperate plea, directing his words to the silent emperor. "They offered us a choice, a different conversation. To deny it is to prove our own inferiority. It is to admit that we are so terrified of a new idea that we must kill the ones who conceived it. Is that the legacy of the Cathar Dominion? An empire so powerful it was undone by a single word." The chamber fell silent, awaiting the emperor's judgment. The immense, ancient being on the obsidian throne seemed to ponder the question. Its telepathic presence, usually a crushing weight, became a fine, probing instrument, sifting through the minds of every delegate, weighing the fury of Vorlag against the transformed conviction of Zorval. An age seemed to pass in that silence. Then the command came, not as a thought, but as a decree that settled over the conclave with the finality of a collapsing star. "We will hear this new conversation." A collective gasp went through the chamber. Grand Marshal Vorlag froze, his carapace turning a shade paler in the cold light. The decision was made. The path of war was closed. The path of dialogue, terrifying and unknown, was to be explored. The Emperor, in his ancient, inscrutable wisdom, had chosen to accept the challenge, not the military challenge Vorlag perceived, but the intellectual one Zorval had described. In the cycles that followed, a fragile, cautious dialogue began. The Annihilator fleets were pulled back. Human vessels, small, elegant ships like the Soliloquy, began to appear in Cathar space, not as invaders, but as invited guests. Cultural exchanges were initiated. Cathar scientists were given access to human academic archives, and their minds recoiled from the sheer, chaotic volume of information, yet they could not deny the profound brilliance they found within. Human artists and philosophers visited the stark, ordered worlds of the Dominion, and they did not mock the Cathar's rigid culture, but instead sought to understand the deep-seated fear of chaos that had birthed it. Zorval and Eva Rostova became the architects of this new, burgeoning relationship. They worked tirelessly to bridge the immense gulf between their two species. The Cathar began to learn that strength was not just about control, but also about resilience, about the ability to adapt and change. The humans, in turn, came to appreciate the stability and profound sense of purpose that the Cathar's order provided. A slow, difficult, but genuine respect began to form. The empire had not fallen, but it was being transformed, its rigid walls slowly becoming more permeable, allowing the light of a new perspective to filter in. It was during one of their working sessions, in a quiet observatory overlooking the Cathar capital, that the final, most profound piece of the puzzle fell into place. Zorval was watching the stars, a habit he had picked up from his human counterparts, trying to see the universe not as a territory to be conquered, but as a mystery to be appreciated. "You have never told me, Ambassador," he said, his gaze still on the starfield, "why your species developed in this unique way. Why this intense focus on fundamental forces? Why this philosophical maturity that so outstrips your technological age? Our histories show that most species at your stage are consumed by expansion, by a frantic adolescent drive to conquer their neighbors. You seem to have skipped that step. Why?" Eva Rostova stood beside him, her expression serene as always, but her eyes held a depth of gravity he had never seen before. "Because we never had the luxury of believing we were alone, or that we were the most important thing in the universe. Our development was not driven by a desire to conquer our neighbors. It was driven by the need to prepare for something else." Zorval turned to her, a sense of deep unease prickling at him. "Prepare for what?" She directed his attention to a holographic display. It showed a map of their local galactic cluster. Then it zoomed out, showing the full spiral of their galaxy. Then it zoomed out further to a scale he had rarely seen, showing the vast, lonely emptiness between galaxies. In that intergalactic void, a single point of light was blinking, so faint it was almost imperceptible. "For centuries," Rostova said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "since the very dawn of our radio astronomy, we have been receiving a signal. It does not come from within our galaxy. It comes from the void. It is incredibly ancient, and it is not complex. It is a simple, repeating mathematical sequence. A beacon." She enhanced the signal on the display. It was a string of prime numbers, a universal hello. But woven into it was another layer of information, a pattern that described a recurring celestial event. A wave of energy, a predictable cyclical wave that swept through galaxies like a fire. "It is not a message of greeting," Rostova continued, her voice heavy with the weight of generations of secret knowledge. "We believe it is a warning, a tombstone left by a civilization or perhaps a whole series of them that faced what is coming. The signal encodes the cycle, the periodicity of the event. It is a galactic-scale extinction event, a great filter that is not internal but external. It scours life from every corner of this galaxy on a timescale so vast that civilizations rise and fall in the quiet periods, never knowing what is coming." Zorval stared at the blinking light, his mind struggling to process the scale of what she was saying. The Har's entire history, their conquests, their obsession with order, all of it had taken place in one of these quiet periods. "Our philosophy, our technology, our entire cultural trajectory," Rostova concluded, "has been shaped by this single, terrifying fact. We realized we could not fight this wave. It is a force of nature. We could not conquer it. We could only hope to understand it and perhaps to endure it. Our mastery of resonance of space-time was not developed to fight wars. It was developed to find a way to shield our world, to potentially phase our entire system out of normal space-time for the brief moment the wave passes. Every resource, every great mind, every sacrifice in our history has ultimately been for this one purpose, to survive the coming storm." She looked at him, her calm eyes now filled with a shared, cosmic dread. "The next wave is due. In galactic terms, it is imminent. We did not answer your threat with one of our own, High Executor, because we are facing a threat so much greater that our two species fighting would be like two children quarreling in a house that is about to be swept away by a tsunami. We do not have time for such things." In that moment, Zorval understood everything. Humanity's strange calm, their deep perspective, their incredible power wielded with such immense restraint. They were not a young race, puffed up with arrogance. They were an ancient soul in a young body, a species that had spent its entire existence staring into the abyss, listening to a warning from the dead. He looked out at the stars again, but he no longer saw them as points of light. He saw them as clocks, ticking down to a moment of unimaginable cleansing. The Cathar Dominion had sent a threat to a small, isolated world, believing itself to be the ultimate power in the galaxy. And that world had replied with, "But," not just to declare its own sovereignty, but to open their eyes to a truth so terrifying it made all notions of empire and conquest utterly, laughably meaningless. The real war was not between them. The real war was against the indifferent, silent, and perfect order of the universe itself, and it was coming for them all.